Clara had been working in the hospital for several years, and she was used to long nights and busy corridors, but she always tried to treat every patient with care. That evening, the hospital felt quieter than usual. The usual rush of doctors, nurses, and patients moving from room to room seemed slower, and the soft hum of machines filled the hallways. Clara walked past rows of rooms, checking on patients and making sure everyone was comfortable. Her heart always felt heavy for those who seemed more alone than sick. It was one of those nights when the weight of responsibility felt heavier, but she moved with a calm determination. When she reached the far end of the ward, she noticed a man sitting alone in a chair by the window. His face was lined with age, and his eyes seemed distant, almost lost in thought. He wasn't talking to anyone, and his tray of untouched food sat on the table beside him. Clara paused for a moment, sensing the deep loneliness in the room. Most people in the hospital were surrounded by visitors or family, but this man had neither. She could feel the quiet sadness radiating from him, a loneliness that seemed heavier than the illness that had brought him there. Clara knocked softly on the door frame and smiled. "Hello, I'm Clara. I'm just checking on you. How are you feeling tonight?" she asked gently. The man turned his head slowly and looked at her, his eyes tired, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer right away, just stared out the window. Clara pulled a chair close and sat down, careful not to seem intrusive. She had learned that sometimes the best comfort was just being present. For a few minutes there was silence, broken only by the soft beeping of a monitor and the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. Clara didn't rush him to talk. She simply offered a quiet presence, letting him know he wasn't completely alone. After a while, he shifted slightly and muttered, "It's hard, being here all the time." His voice was low and almost hesitant, as if he weren't used to speaking to anyone. Clara nodded, understanding. "I can imagine. Hospitals can feel lonely sometimes. Would you like to tell me a little about yourself?" she asked softly. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of interest in his eyes. He began to speak, slowly at first, about his daily routine, the small things he missed about home, and the quietness that filled his days. Clara listened, offering occasional nods and gentle words of encouragement. She didn't press for details. She just let him talk at his own pace. As the evening went on, Clara noticed how the man seemed to relax slightly. The stiffness in his shoulders eased, and he leaned back in the chair a little more comfortably. She brought him a warm blanket from the supply room and tucked it around his shoulders. She also offered him some tea from the small cart she had with her, and he accepted it with a faint smile. It was a small gesture, but it seemed to make a difference. Clara asked him about the things he liked, and he spoke quietly about his love for reading and classical music. He mentioned a few books he had enjoyed long ago and a piece of music that always reminded him of better days. Clara listened attentively, asking questions when appropriate, and even shared a few small stories from her own life. She didn't share much, only enough to make him feel understood and not entirely alone. The conversation was slow and gentle, like a river flowing steadily without rush. As the clock ticked closer to the end of her shift, Clara realized she hadn't moved from her seat for a long time. The man's eyes, which had seemed so heavy with sadness at the beginning of the evening, now looked a little lighter. He didn't speak much, but the quiet presence of someone who genuinely cared seemed to ease the weight he carried. Clara felt a sense of fulfillment, a feeling that what she was doing mattered in a simple yet profound way. Before leaving, she gently said, "I'll come by again tomorrow evening. We can talk some more if you like. You don't have to stay alone." He nodded slightly, a small but sincere gesture of acknowledgement. It wasn't a grand smile or an enthusiastic response, but it was enough for Clara to know that her presence had made a difference, however small. Clara walked down the hallway toward the exit of the ward, her heart a little lighter despite the long hours. She thought about how easy it would have been to ignore him, to finish her rounds and leave. But she knew that small acts of kindness could have a lasting impact. Sometimes simply staying a little longer, listening a little more, or offering a small comfort could mean more than she realized. That night, she left the hospital with a quiet sense of hope, feeling that she had made a small difference in someone's life, even if she didn't know the full story behind his loneliness. Outside, the city lights flickered softly, and the cool night air greeted her. Clara took a deep breath, thinking about the man she had sat with, wondering what stories lay behind those tired eyes. She didn't need to know everything about him to care. She just needed to be there when it mattered. The world often felt too busy, too fast, and too focused on the wrong things. But tonight, in a small hospital room at the far end of the ward, she had slowed down, offered comfort, and perhaps reminded someone that they weren't completely invisible. That night, as Clara lay down to sleep, her thoughts kept returning to the quiet man by the window. She wondered about his life before the hospital, the things he had loved, the people he had lost, and the moments that had brought him to this place of quiet solitude. She felt a gentle resolve that she would return tomorrow and the next day, and for as long as she could, to offer the same patient, quiet kindness that had been so needed tonight. It was a small gesture in the grand scheme of the world, but it was a gesture that could ripple in ways she could not yet see. In the stillness of the night, Clara felt a connection, fragile yet meaningful. The hospital might be filled with the noise of machines, the movement of staff, and the urgency of illness. But moments like these, where one human simply cared for another, held a quiet power. She fell asleep with the thought that even a little time, a listening ear, and a warm smile could begin to heal what illness and loneliness had done. And somewhere in the hospital, a lonely man slept with a little less weight on his heart, knowing that he had been seen and not entirely alone. The next evening, Clara returned to the hospital, her heart carrying the quiet memory of the man she had met the night before. The hospital seemed almost the same, with its soft hum of machines, fluorescent lights flickering slightly in the hallways, and the steady rhythm of footsteps from the night staff. But for Clara there was a sense of anticipation, a hope that the man she had sat with yesterday might find some comfort in her presence again. She walked down the long corridor toward his room, her hands holding a small bag with tea, a blanket, and a few small treats. She had prepared for no reason other than to offer warmth and a small gesture of care. When she arrived, she saw him sitting in the same chair by the window. His gaze was fixed outside, and he seemed smaller somehow, more withdrawn than before. Clara approached quietly, greeting him with her gentle smile. "Good evening," she said softly. "I brought a little tea and something warm to make your evening easier." He looked at her, his eyes tired but curious. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice low but steady. Clara placed the tea on the table and draped the blanket over his shoulders, careful to adjust it so he would be comfortable. She pulled a chair close to his side and sat down, as she had done the night before, giving him space but not leaving him alone. For a few moments they sat in silence. Clara didn't push for conversation, knowing that sometimes quiet companionship was more powerful than words. She could feel his tension slowly ease, the way a heavy coat slips off one's shoulders. Eventually he spoke, softly at first, sharing a memory from long ago about a trip he had taken in his youth. Clara listened attentively, nodding and smiling at the right moments. She asked gentle questions, allowing him to guide the conversation, making him feel that he had control over what he shared. As the evening progressed, Clara noticed that he began to open up more than before. He spoke about his life, his work, and the responsibilities that had weighed on him over the years. He mentioned his late wife, the love they had shared, and the emptiness that had filled his life since she passed. Clara listened with empathy, her heart quietly aching for the man who had carried so much in silence. She offered words of comfort, not grand or dramatic, but simple and sincere, telling him that it was okay to feel sad and that his feelings were valid. Clara also shared small personal stories from her own life, careful not to overshadow his. She spoke about the simple joys she found in everyday moments, like taking a walk in the park or noticing the first flowers of spring. She told him how small acts of kindness from strangers or friends could make a difference, and how even a few minutes of attention could lift a heavy heart. The man listened, occasionally nodding, sometimes offering a quiet laugh at the stories she told. It was a connection that required no grand gestures, only presence and care. As the night wore on, Clara noticed that the man began to trust her. He asked her questions, small ones at first, about her life, why she became a nurse, and what she loved about her work. Clara answered with honesty and warmth, sharing her reasons and her own moments of struggle and joy. She spoke about the satisfaction of helping someone feel seen and cared for, and how even a brief interaction could make a difference. He listened intently, and she could see a spark of life returning to his eyes, a small glimmer of hope that had been missing. Clara also began noticing little details about him. The way he fidgeted with his hands when he was nervous, the way he smiled faintly at certain memories, and the way he seemed to relax in her presence. She realized that her simple presence was giving him a sense of stability in a place that could often feel uncertain and lonely. She stayed late as she had promised, speaking with him, listening to his stories, and simply being there. During one quiet moment, he looked at Clara and said, "You make it easier to be here. I don't know why, but I feel like I can breathe a little." Clara smiled softly, understanding that this was perhaps the first time in a long while that he had felt this sense of relief. She didn't say much, only nodded, letting him feel heard and appreciated. It was a small exchange, but it carried weight beyond words, the kind of quiet acknowledgement that healed in its own way. The night continued, and Clara helped him with small tasks, adjusting his blanket, offering sips of tea, and ensuring he was comfortable. They talked about books he loved, music that moved him, and the small joys that life had once offered him. She encouraged him to share stories he hadn't told anyone, reminding him that his experiences, his memories, and his feelings mattered. Each story, each shared memory was a bridge between the loneliness he had felt and the presence of someone who cared. As the clock ticked closer to her leaving time, Clara knew she had to step away, but she didn't want to break the fragile sense of comfort they had created. She gently reminded him that she would return the next evening as she had promised, and that he didn't have to feel alone. He nodded, his eyes reflecting gratitude and a hint of relief, and for a moment he seemed lighter, the weight of his solitude eased by her care. When Clara finally stood to leave, she took a moment to look at him, seeing the small but meaningful changes. His posture was less rigid, his expression softer, and his eyes held a spark of trust that hadn't been there before. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her time, her presence, and her patience had made a difference. She walked down the hallway, her steps slower than usual, reflecting on the power of simple acts of kindness. Outside the room, the hum of the hospital continued, but Clara felt a sense of calm. She thought about the loneliness that so many people carried quietly, and how a few minutes of genuine attention could make a lasting impact. She realized that her work was more than medical care. It was about being present, listening, and offering comfort where it was most needed. And tonight, she had done that for someone who had felt forgotten and alone. As she left the hospital, Clara's mind lingered on the man's stories and the quiet moments they had shared. She felt a sense of purpose and hope, knowing that she could return tomorrow and continue to offer the same care and presence. She understood that healing wasn't always about medicine or procedures. Sometimes it was about showing someone that they were seen, heard, and valued. And in that quiet, unassuming way, she had begun to make a difference in the life of a man who had felt entirely alone. The following evening, Clara returned to the hospital with a familiar sense of purpose. She knew the man she had been spending time with, the one who seemed so lonely and withdrawn, would be waiting in his usual chair by the window. As she walked down the corridor, she felt a mixture of anticipation and quiet concern, hoping that the small gestures she had offered in previous nights were beginning to make a real difference. When she entered the room, he was already there, sitting with a book he seemed too tired to read, staring out the window as the lights of the city reflected softly on his face. He looked up when Clara approached, and this time, there was a faint warmth in his eyes, a small spark that hadn't been there before. Clara greeted him with a gentle smile and offered him the tea and blanket she always brought. He accepted, and for the first time he returned a small smile that seemed almost shy but genuine. They began the evening slowly, with quiet conversation and pauses that felt natural rather than awkward. Clara listened as he spoke, and gradually he began to reveal more about himself. He shared stories about his past career, describing the long hours, the pressure, and the dedication it took to become successful in his work. He spoke about the highs and lows, the moments of pride, and the regrets that had lingered with him over the years. Clara listened patiently, asking questions gently and offering small affirmations, letting him know that his experiences mattered. He also spoke more openly about his late wife, the woman he had loved for decades. His voice trembled at times, but he didn't shy away from the memories that made him feel both joy and sorrow. Clara stayed silent when necessary, simply offering her presence as a safe space for him to express his grief. She understood that healing wasn't about rushing him or offering solutions. It was about being there, providing comfort through attention and empathy. As the evening continued, he began asking Clara about her life, curious to know more about the person who had been offering him such kindness. She spoke about her journey into nursing, her motivations, and the small joys she found in caring for others. She shared stories about her own challenges and moments of doubt, and he listened intently, occasionally nodding or laughing softly at her anecdotes. It was a gentle exchange, a building of trust that neither of them could have predicted when she first entered the room. Clara noticed how he was beginning to open up in ways he hadn't before. He talked about his family, the estrangement from his children that had weighed heavily on his heart, and the loneliness that had grown since his wife's passing. Clara listened without judgment, offering gentle words of encouragement and understanding. She encouraged him to reconnect in small ways, to take steps toward rebuilding those relationships, even if they were difficult or awkward. During their conversation, he revealed a surprising vulnerability. He admitted that he had spent so many years focused on his work and responsibilities that he had neglected the emotional connections in his life. Clara responded with empathy, reminding him that it was never too late to make meaningful changes, that even small efforts could lead to significant improvements in his relationships and sense of belonging. Clara also observed the small shifts in his demeanor. He leaned back in his chair more comfortably, gestured with his hands as he spoke, and occasionally laughed at stories or memories. These small signs showed her that the man was beginning to feel more at ease, more human, and less burdened by the isolation he had carried for so long. Clara felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, knowing that her presence had helped create a space where he could begin to heal emotionally. As the night wore on, they talked about hobbies and interests he had once loved. He mentioned a passion for classical music and reading, and Clara encouraged him to rediscover those joys, to engage in activities that brought him peace and happiness. She even suggested that they could listen to music together during her visits, turning the hospital room into a small sanctuary of comfort and shared experience. He responded with a hesitant but hopeful tone, clearly touched by her thoughtfulness. Throughout the evening, Clara continued to be attentive to his needs, adjusting his blanket, offering sips of tea, and ensuring he was physically comfortable. These small acts of care were paired with meaningful conversation, creating an atmosphere of warmth and trust. She realized that her role extended beyond medical duties. She was providing emotional support, companionship, and a sense of stability in an otherwise lonely environment. At one point, he paused and looked at Clara with a depth of gratitude in his eyes. "I don't know why I feel this way, but being here with you makes the hospital feel less like a prison," he said quietly. Clara smiled softly, acknowledging his words without needing to respond with anything elaborate. Sometimes silence and presence spoke louder than any reassurances could. As the clock approached the end of her shift, Clara knew she had to leave, but she was careful to do so in a way that didn't disrupt the newfound comfort they had established. She reminded him gently that she would return the next evening, and that he could look forward to their continued conversations. He nodded, a subtle but meaningful gesture, signaling his trust and appreciation. Walking down the hallway, Clara reflected on the journey they had taken together over the past few nights. She thought about how small acts of kindness, consistent presence, and genuine care could break through walls of loneliness and grief. She realized that while she had only intended to offer comfort for a few moments each evening, the impact had been far greater, creating a ripple effect in his emotional well-being. Outside the room, the hospital continued its steady rhythm of life, but Clara carried with her a quiet sense of fulfillment. She understood that healing wasn't always about medicine or treatment. Sometimes it was about human connection, empathy, and patience. She felt grateful that she could offer even a small part of that to someone who had spent so long in isolation. That night, as she left the hospital and stepped into the cool air of the evening, Clara's thoughts lingered on the man and the stories he had shared. She felt a quiet hope for the future, knowing that their conversations and shared moments could continue to bring him comfort, and perhaps even inspire him to reconnect with the world outside the hospital. She walked home slowly, reflecting on the power of being present, the importance of listening, and the profound impact that simple acts of care could have on a person's life. As she drifted off to sleep, Clara felt a deep sense of purpose and gratitude. She knew that the connection they had begun to build was fragile yet meaningful, and she looked forward to continuing to nurture it. Somewhere in the hospital, a lonely man was feeling lighter, more seen, and more understood. And that knowledge filled Clara with quiet joy and determination to continue making a difference, one evening at a time. That evening, Clara returned to the hospital with her usual quiet determination. The man she had been spending time with had become the focus of her thoughts since the day they met. She had witnessed a small but noticeable change in him over the past nights, and she felt a quiet hope that this evening might bring another step forward in his healing. As she entered the ward, she saw him sitting in his usual chair by the window, a book resting unopened on his lap. He looked up when he saw her, and there was a faint light in his eyes, a sign that her visits were beginning to bring him comfort. Clara greeted him warmly and offered the tea and blanket she always brought. He accepted, and for a moment they simply sat together in silence, letting the quietness of the room fill the space between them. Eventually he began to speak, sharing more personal memories than he had before. He talked about his family, about the children he had grown distant from, and about the regrets that had built up over the years. Clara listened without judgment, offering gentle encouragement and reassurance. She suggested small ways he could begin to reconnect, like sending a simple note or making a short phone call. At first he hesitated, unsure if he could bridge the gap, but Clara's calm presence helped him feel that even small steps could make a difference. They spent the next hours talking quietly about his past, his work, and his late wife. He shared stories of his career, the people he had met, and the accomplishments he had once been proud of. Clara listened, asking questions that invited him to reflect and share. She also shared small anecdotes from her own life, not to shift focus onto herself, but to create a sense of balance and connection in their conversation. Clara noticed that he was beginning to smile more often, a subtle change that spoke volumes. The lines of sadness on his face softened slightly, and there was a sense of ease in his posture that hadn't been there before. She encouraged him to revisit activities he had once enjoyed, like reading, listening to music, or even taking short walks when his health allowed. He responded with cautious optimism, clearly touched by her thoughtfulness. As the night progressed, Clara helped him organize a few letters and notes he had written over the years, ones he had never sent to family members. She encouraged him to send a few, explaining that even a small gesture could begin to repair relationships. He looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear, unsure if his children would respond, but Clara assured him that taking the first step was the most important part. During a quiet moment, he looked at Clara with gratitude in his eyes. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he said softly. "You've made me realize that I'm not as alone as I thought." Clara smiled gently, feeling the weight of his words. She knew that her consistent care, her willingness to listen, and her quiet presence had begun to break through the walls he had built around himself. They continued to talk, sharing memories, dreams, and small reflections on life. Clara encouraged him to focus on the positive aspects of his past and the possibilities that still lay ahead. She reminded him that healing was a gradual process and that taking small steps toward reconnecting with his family and the world could bring meaningful change. As the evening drew to a close, Clara helped him prepare a small note to his daughter, encouraging him to express his feelings honestly and openly. He looked at her with a mixture of nervousness and gratitude, clearly understanding that this was a significant step in rebuilding a connection he had long neglected. Clara reassured him that it was okay to feel vulnerable, and that expressing emotions was a sign of strength, not weakness. Before leaving, she gently reminded him that she would return the next evening, and that he could continue to rely on her presence and support. He nodded, a subtle but meaningful gesture that reflected his growing trust and comfort. Clara left the room with a quiet sense of fulfillment, knowing that her care and attention had helped him take meaningful steps toward emotional healing. Walking down the hallway, Clara reflected on the journey they had shared over the past nights. She realized that her role extended far beyond her duties as a nurse. She was providing emotional support, companionship, and a sense of stability in a place that could often feel cold and impersonal. Her quiet acts of kindness and consistent presence had begun to transform not only his hospital experience, but also his outlook on life. Outside the room, the hum of the hospital continued, but Clara carried with her a sense of purpose and hope. She understood that true healing involved more than medicine and treatment. It required empathy, patience, and genuine human connection. She felt grateful that she could offer even a small part of that to someone who had spent so long in isolation. That night, as she returned home and prepared for bed, Clara's thoughts lingered on the man and the progress he had made. She felt a quiet hope that the letters he had begun to send would spark reconnections with his family, and that the sense of loneliness that had weighed on him for years would gradually ease. She drifted off to sleep with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that her presence and care had made a real difference in someone's life, and she looked forward to continuing this journey of healing and connection in the evenings to come. The following evening, Clara returned to the hospital with the familiar mix of quiet determination and gentle anticipation. She had grown accustomed to her nightly visits, and they had become more than a routine. They had become a source of purpose and fulfillment. She walked down the corridor toward the room where the man had been sitting alone, a small sense of excitement stirring within her at the thought of seeing him again. When she entered the room, he was there, sitting upright in his chair by the window, a stack of letters beside him. He looked up and smiled warmly, a real smile this time, one that reached his eyes. Clara returned the smile, setting down the tea and blanket she had brought, and they settled into their evening ritual of quiet conversation and shared stories. This evening felt different. There was a lightness in the air, a subtle shift in the energy between them. The man spoke about the letters he had sent to his children and the responses he had received. Some were cautious, some hesitant, but they were responses nonetheless. He described how nervous he had felt at first, how he doubted whether his gestures would be accepted, and how surprised he was to find that small steps could begin to bridge the gaps of years. Clara listened intently, feeling a quiet joy at his progress. They talked for hours, not just about the past, but also about the present and the possibilities of the future. He began to express hopes he had almost forgotten he possessed. He spoke of reconnecting with friends, resuming hobbies, and even considering volunteering in small ways to give back to others. Clara encouraged these thoughts, offering gentle guidance and reassurance, letting him know that it was never too late to embrace life fully again. As the conversation continued, he began to open up about deeper feelings, the grief that had lingered since his wife's passing, and the loneliness that had seemed insurmountable. Clara sat quietly, her presence steady and supportive. She offered words of comfort when necessary, but mostly she simply listened, letting him express his emotions without fear of judgment. She understood that healing was not linear, and that moments of vulnerability were essential for growth and reconnection. They also shared laughter and light-hearted moments. He recounted funny memories from his past, stories about work colleagues, and playful incidents from his younger days. Clara joined in with her own anecdotes, creating a balance of joy and reflection in the room. These moments of levity were as important as the serious conversations, for they reminded both of them of the richness of life and the importance of embracing all its facets. During a quiet pause, he looked at Clara with gratitude that seemed to overflow beyond words. "I don't know what I would have done without your visits," he said softly. "You've given me something I didn't know I needed, someone who cares enough to just be here." Clara felt a deep warmth in her heart, understanding that her consistent presence had been a lifeline in ways she could not have imagined. She responded with a simple smile, acknowledging his words without making them about herself, letting him fully feel the impact of his own transformation. They continued to plan small steps for the days ahead. He talked about calling old friends, writing more letters, and even inviting his children for a short visit when he felt ready. Clara offered encouragement, emphasizing that taking one step at a time was enough. She reminded him that healing and reconnection were gradual processes, and that every small action he took was significant. As the night progressed, she helped him organize a few more letters and even suggested ways to make small improvements to his room, to make it feel more like home. He took these suggestions to heart, and there was a visible lightness in his demeanor, a sense of control and agency returning to his life. Clara felt proud, not for herself, but for the courage he displayed in opening himself up and taking steps toward emotional recovery. Eventually, the time came for Clara to leave. She stood quietly, observing the man who now seemed more at ease, more confident, and more hopeful than when she first met him. She reminded him gently that she would return, and that her support would continue as he navigated the next steps in rebuilding his connections and embracing life again. He nodded, a mixture of gratitude and quiet determination in his eyes. signaling that he understood the value of what they had shared and the journey that still lay ahead. Walking down the hallway, Clara reflected on the transformation she had witnessed. She thought about how simple acts of kindness, consistent presence, and genuine empathy could profoundly affect a person's life. She realized that her role as a nurse extended far beyond medical care. It encompassed emotional support, human connection, and the power of listening with patience and compassion. Outside the hospital, the cool night air wrapped around her, bringing a sense of calm and fulfillment. Clara knew that her visits had made a difference, not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through steady, genuine care. She felt grateful to be part of this man's journey, to witness his gradual return to life, hope, and connection. That night, as Clara prepared for bed, she thought of the man sitting by the window, now lighter in spirit, writing letters, planning visits, and embracing small joys once more. She felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that her consistent presence had helped him feel seen, valued, and less alone. It was a reminder that even small acts of kindness could ripple into profound change, touching lives in ways that were often unseen but deeply felt. In the quiet of her room, Clara drifted into sleep with a sense of peace and purpose. She knew that her work, her care, and her willingness to stay just a little longer had brought hope and healing to someone who had once felt invisible. And somewhere in the hospital, a man who had carried loneliness for far too long now felt the warmth of human connection, ready to embrace life again step by step, guided by the quiet power of compassion. The following week, Clara returned to the hospital with a sense of calm confidence. The man she had been spending her evenings with had shown remarkable progress, and she felt a quiet satisfaction in witnessing his slow but steady transformation. The hospital corridors were alive with the usual sounds, but Clara's focus was singular. She wanted to continue providing the comfort, support, and understanding that had become the cornerstone of their relationship. When she entered his room, she noticed a subtle change immediately. He was sitting upright in his chair, a small stack of letters on the side table, and a faint smile on his face that seemed to reach deeper than it had before. His eyes met hers, and there was warmth, curiosity, and even a hint of anticipation. Clara returned his smile, setting down her bag with tea, blankets, and a few simple treats, prepared for another evening of quiet companionship. They began the night with small talk, discussing lighter subjects at first, like the view from the window and the way the evening sun cast soft shadows across the room. Clara could sense that he was more relaxed than in previous nights, more willing to share and more open to conversation. She encouraged him gently, asking about his day and if he had managed to take any small steps toward reconnecting with his family or friends. His responses reflected cautious optimism. He spoke about calls he had made, letters sent, and even a tentative plan to invite a close friend for a short visit. Clara listened intently, offering quiet affirmations and gentle encouragement. She understood that emotional healing required patience and that each small victory needed acknowledgement. She reminded him that progress wasn't always linear, and that setbacks were normal and didn't erase the steps he had already taken. Her words were simple but heartfelt, grounded in empathy and experience, helping him feel supported without pressure. The man began to speak more openly about his feelings than he had before. He described moments of lingering grief, the pangs of loneliness that sometimes returned, and the fears he had about reconnecting with people he had hurt or distanced himself from. Clara offered her presence and listening ear, sometimes speaking when appropriate, sometimes simply sitting quietly, allowing him to explore and express his emotions safely. She reminded him that vulnerability was not weakness but a sign of courage, and that facing difficult emotions was a step toward genuine connection and healing. As the evening continued, they delved into more personal topics. He shared memories of his late wife, recounting small anecdotes that carried both joy and sorrow. Claire encouraged him to cherish those memories while also allowing himself to move forward. They spoke about the importance of finding balance between remembering the past and embracing the present, and how opening oneself to connection could coexist with honoring loss. She offered practical suggestions as well, like revisiting hobbies, writing letters, or listening to music that brought peace. There were moments of laughter and light-hearted conversation, too. He recounted humorous incidents from his past, sometimes about work, sometimes about ordinary daily life. Clara shared her own small stories, creating a sense of shared humanity and comfort. These moments were vital, breaking the heaviness that had once filled the room and reminding both of them of life's simple joys. Clara also helped him organize his letters, reflecting on the responses he had received and planning gentle ways to continue reconnecting with family and friends. They discussed small steps like sending another letter, making a call, or planning a short visit. He seemed more confident and less hesitant, clearly buoyed by the progress he had already made. Clara praised his efforts, emphasizing that the courage to try even in small ways was itself a remarkable achievement. Throughout the evening, Clara was attentive to his physical comfort as well. She adjusted his blanket, offered warm tea, and ensured he was seated comfortably. But more importantly, she maintained a presence that was steady and reassuring, a constant reminder that he was not alone. It was in this quiet companionship that he began to feel a renewed sense of self-worth and hope, slowly reclaiming the life that had seemed distant and unattainable. As the night wore on, the man began to reflect on the changes he had experienced over the past weeks. He spoke about feeling lighter, more connected, and more hopeful. He admitted that there were still moments of fear and doubt, but they were now interspersed with hope and anticipation. Clara listened, offering gentle encouragement, and together they acknowledged the progress made, however gradual it had been. Before leaving, Clara reminded him of the importance of self-compassion and patience. She emphasized that he had already achieved much by facing his emotions, reconnecting with family and friends, and allowing himself to feel deeply again. He looked at her with gratitude, and this time, the smile on his face carried a depth of warmth and trust that spoke louder than words. It was a testament to the journey they had shared, and to the quiet power of consistent care and human connection. Walking down the hallway, Clara reflected on the impact of her visits. She realized that the small, deliberate actions she had taken, staying a little longer, listening attentively, offering simple comforts, had facilitated a profound transformation in someone who had felt isolated for so long. She understood that compassion and patience could ripple through a person's life, rekindling hope, restoring confidence, and helping them reconnect with the world around them. Outside the hospital, the evening air was cool and refreshing. Clara felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that her presence had helped someone rediscover a sense of purpose, connection, and joy. She understood that the journey was ongoing, that healing was a process, but she took comfort in knowing that she had provided the foundation for positive change. That night, as Clara returned home and prepared for sleep, her thoughts lingered on the man who had once seemed so lost and lonely. She felt gratitude for the trust he had placed in her, for the small victories they had achieved together, and for the profound reminder of the difference human connection could make. She drifted into a peaceful sleep, confident that he was now on a path toward emotional recovery, carrying with him the warmth, understanding, and kindness that had become a steady presence in his life. In the quiet of the hospital, a man who had once felt forgotten now faced the future with hope, guided by the simple yet transformative power of genuine compassion. The nights at the hospital had become a routine that Clara looked forward to, a time when her work transcended medical duties and became a connection between two human beings. She walked down the familiar corridor with a sense of calm and purpose, carrying her small bag with tea, a blanket, and a few treats for the man she had been visiting. Each visit had brought subtle changes, both in him and in the way Clara viewed the power of quiet care. When she entered the room, he was sitting by the window, gazing outside at the city lights. There was a calmness in his expression that had not been there weeks ago. His posture was straighter, his hands rested more easily on his lap, and the faint smile on his face hinted at a growing confidence. Clara returned his smile and placed the tea and blanket on the table. He accepted them warmly, and she pulled a chair close, settling in for another evening of conversation and companionship. The man began by sharing his day, speaking about the calls he had made and the letters he had sent. Some responses had been positive, others hesitant, but each one had been a step forward. Clara listened carefully, offering gentle encouragement and praise for his efforts. She reminded him that even small steps toward rebuilding connections were significant and meaningful. His eyes reflected both relief and cautious hope, as if he were beginning to trust the process of re-engaging with the world. They talked about the importance of forgiveness, both of oneself and of others. The man admitted he had carried guilt and regret for years, feeling that he had let his loved ones down. Clara gently explained that healing and reconnection required self-compassion, and that taking responsibility did not mean carrying the weight of the past indefinitely. She encouraged him to focus on the present and the steps he could take to rebuild relationships, emphasizing that sincerity and effort often outweighed perfection. The conversation shifted to hobbies and interests he had once enjoyed but had abandoned over the years. He spoke about music, literature, and simple walks in the park. Clara encouraged him to revisit these passions, suggesting they could find small ways to incorporate them into his daily life, even while he was still in the hospital. He responded with enthusiasm, his voice carrying a renewed energy, a reflection of the hope that had begun to take root. Clara also shared her own stories, small reflections from her day and experiences that highlighted the beauty of ordinary moments. She spoke about the joy in watching a sunrise, the comfort of a warm cup of tea, and the satisfaction of seeing someone smile. The man listened with interest, occasionally nodding, and their conversation became a rhythm of shared experiences, mutual understanding, and subtle joy. As the evening progressed, the man grew more introspective, discussing his fears and vulnerabilities. Clara sat quietly, letting him speak, and occasionally offered gentle guidance. She reminded him that acknowledging fear was a form of strength, and that embracing vulnerability could lead to deeper connections with others. Her words were soft but firm, encouraging him to face his emotions without judgment. They also spent time planning for the future. The man spoke about visiting old friends, attending small social gatherings, and slowly reconnecting with family members. Clara supported these plans, offering advice on pacing himself and taking gradual steps. She emphasized that rebuilding relationships required patience and persistence, and that even setbacks were part of the journey. The man seemed reassured, his earlier hesitation replaced with cautious optimism. During a quiet pause, he looked at Clara and said, "I never realized how much just having someone listen could change things. You've helped me see that I can take small steps, and that it matters." Clara felt a quiet warmth in her heart, understanding that the consistent care and attention she had given had created a meaningful impact. She acknowledged his words with a smile, letting him feel the weight and sincerity of his own realization. As the night went on, they shared moments of laughter and light conversation, recounting amusing incidents from the past and observing small, joyful details in the hospital environment. These moments of levity were as important as the serious discussions, providing balance and reminding both of them of the simple joys that life could offer. Clara felt a sense of connection that transcended words, a silent understanding that this companionship was healing in itself. Clara helped him organize some of his belongings, ensuring he had a comfortable space and easy access to items that brought him joy. She suggested small ways to make the hospital room feel more personal, a little more like home. The man responded eagerly, clearly appreciating her thoughtfulness. There was a visible sense of pride and comfort in his movements, a reflection of his growing confidence and sense of agency. As her shift drew to an end, Clara reminded him of the importance of rest and self-care. She encouraged him to continue practicing small steps toward reconnecting with loved ones, pursuing interests and nurturing his emotional well-being. He nodded, gratitude and determination reflected in his eyes. Clara left the room with a quiet sense of fulfillment, knowing that her presence had contributed to his ongoing journey of healing and reconnection. Walking down the hospital corridor, Clara reflected on the transformation she had witnessed. She considered how consistent care, patience, and genuine human connection could reshape a person's life, providing hope and strength in moments of despair. She understood that her role went beyond nursing duties, extending into the realm of emotional support, encouragement, and presence. Each evening, she had contributed to building a foundation of trust, comfort, and healing. Outside, the cool night air greeted her, and she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She knew that the man was no longer as isolated or lonely as when she first met him. He had begun to rediscover his sense of self, reconnect with others, and embrace small joys that had been absent for years. Clara felt grateful for the trust he had placed in her, and for the opportunity to witness his gradual transformation. That night, as she prepared for sleep, Clara's thoughts lingered on the man and the journey they had shared. She felt a profound understanding of the impact of empathy, patience, and consistent human connection. The man who had once felt forgotten and alone was now stepping into a life filled with hope, supported by the quiet, steadfast care that Clara had provided. She drifted into sleep with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that her presence had helped change a life one evening at a time.